Hello and welcome to week 7 in social psychology. In week 7 we're going to be taking on 2 chapters, and that includes chapter 12 on culture and chapter 13 on social comparison. So let's dive right in here to chapter 12, and here we have the course book, and it starts off with a kind of an article that I found. It's a little dated, but it starts out with a definitive owning of the fact that the field of psychology has been largely based upon a Western culture perspective. And it lacks, or it has lacked, or it needs to compensate for the fact that not a lot of research in psychology is being validated on an international scale. Here we are talking about the importance of culture and its effect on human beings, and yet a lot of the research that has been done in the field of psychology has been done particularly around Western culture. So we have a lot of missing information. Most of the information about worldwide psychology is missing, and we have a tendency to assume that because it works in Western culture, works in those other cultures, and we know that that's not true. So it's a very interesting article. It's a lengthy read. It's a research article from this person who is a researcher in personality testing and the challenges that she faced transforming that, the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, my favorite test to name, is in her translation of that to a new culture and her struggles with that. And she really points to this notion that the field of psychology is lacking in this particular way. So as we look at culture, we kind of have this really a need right now to borrow from the other field, the field of sociology, that really deals with this most directly, and the concept of culture itself and what is that. And the analogy that I use both in this class and in my sociology class is that culture is to us like fish, like water is to fish. It permeates us. It's all around us. In fact, it's so everywhere that we rarely take notice of it. Just like a fish is probably somewhat unaware of the water till it's gone, then it's become very aware of it, but it's so part of their everyday existence that it's hard for them to pinpoint what it is. So culture is all around you. Now the field of sociology divides it into 2 parts. There's material culture, which is the artifacts, the machines. I'm looking around the room, the computer, the lights, my guitar, the carpeting, anything that's around me is a product of the technology and advances in manufacturing and sales and economy and what of my culture. So that's an important part of my understanding of my world. The other part is non-material culture. And in sociology, I kind of group those into 3 areas, and it's norms, values, and expectations. And I go over that a little bit in the book. And the norms are patterns of behavior, things that are normal. And then from that we get the idea of abnormal too. So if it's patterns of behavior that are supported by a majority of the members of that group. Now, values are the things that are important, and they're hierarchical organization of those things. Whether could be material objects. Some material objects might be more important than others, and some concepts or ideas might be more important than others. And then expectations. And expectations, it's easy to get norms and expectations confused, but expectations is our idea of how the world is supposed to work. When I do something, how is the world supposed to respond to me? The social structure of our world and all that. And so norms, values, and expectations are what constitute the non-material culture. And you could probably imagine right there, material culture, how that impacts the way I think. The fact that I have a computer, that I have the internet, changes the way I understand and access information. The fact that we live in a world that has different roles for people, and I don't necessarily grow my own food. There are farmers that have that, and my expectation is that those farmers grow the food, I access it through the store, and all of these, how things are supposed to work, these expectations. And when those start to break down, let's say during the pandemic, when these start to break down and we're not able to go to the store, we're not able to, or maybe we become overly dependent on our devices for communicating in a way that we're not familiar with, that causes anxiety because it's a culture shift. It's affecting the way we understand the world. We call this in sociology the sociological imagination, our understanding of how the world works. And then when things shift, that can cause anxiety. So we see kind of a back and forth, because our psychology has created our society impacts us. So that, of course, talking about culture is vitally important for our understanding in this field. First and foremost, really looking back at the attention-getting section here, we understand that we're ethnocentric. And ethnocentric means my ethnicity, or the word that describes my culture, that's different than race. So you have ethnicity is my culture, and the specific norms, values, expectations, and material culture that I have shape the way I see things. I'm going to see them through that lens. That will inhibit me from seeing certain things. I'm going to be looking for validation of my own points of view, and I'll often think that things that are different than mine are wrong, in a way, maybe, or they're uncomfortable, or whatever. And depending how an individual approaches that, their openness to the experience or their self-recognition of ethnocentrism gives that person the ability to say, to have less impact in terms of ethnocentrism when they encounter a culture different than their own. We all have this. We all have this to some degree, and in some areas they might be very, very loose, like in food. Like maybe we encounter a culture that eats bugs, and we're like, I don't usually view that as food, but hey, why not? And you feel free to be able to do that. As, you know, a reflection of your personality, openness to experience, your ability to see outside of your own ethnocentric point of view and be okay with that. Now, then you might encounter another aspect, let's say in the practices of parents and how they parent their kids, how they discipline their kids, and you might have like, nope, that's wrong and I'm right. So it's okay to eat bugs, even though I don't eat bugs, but it's not okay to treat your children that way. And both of those are ethnocentric. Now, there's a value system that may, you know, obviously we think, let's say, if the situation was abuse or something like that with the child, of course, we maybe want to draw a line that is kind of universal. We try to do that. Try and draw a line that's universal. Probably not a good idea to beat your kids that way if that was the particular situation. But we don't even have to go that far before we would say, nope, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't cater to my kids the way they do. Those kids are going to be... And you see where the ethnocentrism, in my point of view, is right, yours is wrong, but it wasn't right and wrong when we were talking about the food choices. So you can see different areas of our lives will be more ethnocentric than others. And in psychology, even the field itself has a profound ethnocentric component. Think of it like the theories and models that we've created in Western psychology become the culture of that psychology, the knowledge base, the understanding of the way things are, the way things work. And then we go into a culture that is not Western and we say, here, this is the theory of personality that we have. Let's see how you folks do. And it might not fit. And we see that in that paper, you know, when they looked at the MMPI, it didn't really fit the kind of application they thought it was going to. So we want to keep in mind that that bias exists. Now, when we look at societies, and we look at cultures, we can examine them, and I'm going to be having you do this, examine cultures on 2 dimensions. Now we're looking at, you know, what about culture affects us? You know, what important aspects of this that we see internationally that we know will create different kinds of people, will create different kinds of psychology. And the horizontal axis has to do with more collective and on one end and more independent at the other. So the primary unit of curiosity, let's say, on the independent level is the individual, the individual person. You can probably imagine Western culture is very individualistic. the primary unit of consideration in other cultures might be the family before the individual, the family unit or the work unit or the community. Much more communal sense of the importance of that in culture, and you can see how that would create different psychologies. Now the other dimension, the vertical axis of the dimensions, so we have 4 different cells here if you think of this like a box. The vertical dimension has to do with equality and inequality. And now before we get into, there's issues of inequality, of unfairness and all that stuff, and that's not only, it's encompassing that, but that's not only what we're talking about. We're also talking about that we're a culture that is very into inequality, is very into who's number 1, who's number 2, who's number 3. Who's the richest? Who's the tallest? Who's the shortest? Which team wins? And you can see where Western culture is very hierarchical in that. It has its negative components too in terms of unfair inequality. That's what we study in sociology and inequality and whatnot. But you can see how that's kind of, we're sort of into that. Western culture is really hierarchical. We want to know the dean's list. We have grades. They go A, B, C. There's no pass, fail is not enough. Not enough for many people. They want to know, well, how much did I pass? I want to know how high I went in terms of how I did compared to others. Hence the next chapter, social comparison. And on the other end is equity. That is less a part of understanding humanity. And you're going to see, just as I'm trying to explain this, my own ethnocentrism is apparent because I can easily come up with examples of hierarchical aspects of our culture. I will struggle to come up with aspects of our culture that are not that way, that are very equitable, that those seem, our society doesn't have a lot of those. And so we would even struggle coming up with examples. We would even struggle coming up with examples of communal. You'll see in the graphic that I have here in the course book, I have the top left-hand quadrant here, which is independent and hierarchical or inequality. Here we have the United States. Over to, if we high inequality over to interdependence, still unequal, but more interdependent. We have communalism. And then as we go down from there, we go into communal living or collectivism, and then over toward independence and equality, we see democratic socialism. You see these models of the way people think, but they create a very different mode of thinking. And interestingly enough, democratic socialism is a rising political force in the United States, and what it relates to is still that independent part, still that individuals are still the center, but that there's a more equality. That we try to avoid the systemic inequality that exists so much at the top of the other dimension, that we want individuals who are democratic socialists. We like to create policies that will engage more equity, still holding on to individuality. There's a balance point there, and this of course creates all sorts of political arguments and whatnot in favor and out of favor of that particular way of thinking. But you see, these dimensions sort of like, these are the kinds, this kind of describes in a way the way in which we can organize cultures around the world. Now, culture is learned. So we may have predispositions, we may have ways that we feel comfortable with in terms of acting in the world, and those are selectively reinforced by our culture. And we may be counterculture, we may be non-compliant, we're not doing what everybody else does, that's kind of what we do. In fact, that's sort of the individualism too, is that kind of, I'm going to separate myself from the norms and whatnot. And but we do learn the rules through a process that in sociology we call socialization, or the passing on of culture from generation to generation. And we learn those things through various agents of socialization, including the family, school, religious organizations, the government, the economy, the media, all of these things. That's where we learn the rules and the counter rules. And so so this is all part of the way in which societies transfer that knowledge from one generation to the next. Now, at this point in the coursebook, we look at some other areas of psychology that are impacted by culture. These are ways things work. And I could probably imagine every one of you could, if I put a question mark at the end of each one of these statements, what are the roles in relationships? What is the importance of career or work? How do you raise children? What's the role of elderly in daily life? That you would come up with an answer for that is based upon the culture that you were raised in, and the decisions that you've made, and the experiences that you've had, and say this is the way things should be. And it's shaped the way you think and act, and even be in those. Your role in relationships is impacted. Your actions are impacted by values, norms, and expectations that you inherited and were taught by your society. So this goes over a list, and that's going to be important in the assignments, because in the assignments, the discussion itself has you look at those two verses. You look at those two dimensions of understanding society, and see if you can come up with aspects of yourself in each quadrant. So, is there an aspect of yourself that's very independent and very hierarchical? Is there a part of your society, your culture, that is hierarchical but very collective? Maybe there's a very equitable but very independent aspect of yourself, and then maybe there's a independent, collective and equitable part of your situation. So I'll just, off the top of my head right here, I'll think of something I'm very individualistic and very competitive about: my education, getting higher and higher degrees and whatnot. And let me think about what would that be more on a collective basis. Would be let's see, individually, but less hierarchical, but more collective. Team sports. I'm on a, it's a collective. There's a group of us, and the group of us winning, getting the hierarchical is going to be important, but it's over there on the more collective end. Now let's say, I'm going to look at the other dimension, and we have individualistic, and it was non-hierarchical, and that would be, let's say, debates that I have. That can become hierarchical too. Maybe a tough one to come up with. Individualistic, but equitable. So maybe if I'm serving on committee, I serve on some board of directors and stuff. So there's there's an individual part, but we're all the same. There's that. My contribution to a group, a team. Yeah, that works. Okay, and then the other one would be, what's very communal and non-hierarchical, and that might be my family. And so, now throw out some hints to see if you can deviate from what I've told you to do here in terms of, let's see it. That's why I want this to be a discussion, because maybe someone will say something that will inspire us to come up with examples for these, even though we have a tendency toward that upper left quadrant thing. Now, the assignment, however, has to do with this list that I just went over. So if we look at that list again, and we have our role in relationships, the elderly, perceptions of physical beauty, go to the next page, art and music, expectation, what does it mean to become an adult, what being an adult means, the desire for material wealth or whatever. And the assignment, what I want you to do is to pick two of those areas, and I call them expressions, expressions of your psychology in the context of your culture, and define, your own, define your own particular cultural perspective, and then do research from a valid and reliable source on an alternative culture, and that may be different or slightly different or way different or whatever. It really doesn't matter, and see where that is, and then reflect on those differences. So you take two of those expressions and you reflect on your own, and then you reflect on the other cultures. And then a little essay at the end where you talk not about good and bad, this is better or anything like that. Talk about why it's important for us to understand other cultural points of view as being valid. Now, keep in mind, we can also look at what in sociology we call subcultures, or in communication we call them countercultures, which is other smaller cultural groups that exist around us. We don't have to go to another country to do this. We just go to another culture. So there might be let's say people that are part of United Bikers of Maine, and how are they different in some of these ways than you are, or how other people say you're the member of the United Bikers of Maine or something like that. My point being, look at it from a cultural point of view, and you don't necessarily have to think like I have to look at, a European nation or an African nation or something like that to get this information. Just thinking about those cultures. Okay, so that's chapter 12. The next chapter, chapter 13, is going into social comparison. Okay, going right into chapter 13, we talk about why do we need to compare ourselves to others. And one of the first things that comes out of our material is the need for self-evaluation, that we come to an understanding of ourselves in light of how we compare to other people, what they're doing, where they are. And again, you can see this on that culture hierarchy too. Let's say I want to be a better golfer. So I'm going to look at really good golfers and I'm going to compare myself to them, and therefore understand better where I'm coming from so that I can become a better golfer. I'm going to try and imitate them. And that'd be a society that is a little, I'm kind of emphasizing that sort of, as an individual, I want to get better, but so I'm going to look at the hierarchy of individuals that are doing things that I want to be able to do. And that this is identified as a need, that we have a need to interact with other people because it allows us to know ourselves better. And this really kind of ties into a concept that I brought up in chapter 6, which is looking glass self. Now, and reference groups. And then, so looking glass self, as we've already discussed, is how we use the opinions of others to formulate a self-concept for us. We don't necessarily need to hear what their opinions are. The concept of the looking glass self is that I imagine what they would say about me and my behavior. Looking in the mirror, I can see the reality. How would Mom think about this? How would Tiger Woods think about my swing? Anything like that. I can imagine those things, so you can see how the comparison between one person's perspective of how things should be and what I'm seeing in reality helps me, or is a part of creating my self-concept. So this is all wrapped up into that, what I call the committee of people, the very important individuals that we have on this this number of people that we rely upon to help us understand who we are. Now, reference groups are individuals. Let's say I'm going to have to modify my extended version of what looking glass self means. Maybe we have some external committees on our looking glass self. They're not members of our group. We do not belong to these groups, but we might reference them and say, I want to be like them. So you're going to school, you want to be a nurse, your reference group is nurses. So someday you want to be a nurse, so you look to nurses, you look at what their culture is, you look at the norms, values, expectations, and whatnot it is to be a nurse, and you're going to school as a process of socialization, passing on that culture, nurse culture, from one generation to the next. That's what education is, passing on the culture of a profession. And so, looking glass self, for social comparison, but then also reference groups and how well am I doing? How well am I doing? You know, your grades in your courses reflect how close are you approximating the kind of norms, values, and expectations in your given profession. You can kind of see it that way. So another way that we use is to self-evaluation and to maintain our sense of who we are, and that is kind of dicey, I could say, because we have a tendency sometimes to want to keep the status quo. I want to feel good about myself, let's say. So constantly comparing myself to let's say a reference group that's unattainable might be very painful, might be very difficult to maintain. And so we do have a tendency to select individuals who will maintain our current sense of self, unless you have in the next section, a growth mentality. This is a characteristic, a 21st century skill here, is a growth mentality of being okay with more comparison to individuals that are doing better than you and using that as a way to move yourself forward. So that's a kind of a personality aspect of the social comparison. There are some people that status quo, you know, and they'll surround themselves with people who will maintain that status quo. And there are other people that are going to surround themselves with individuals they want to be more like, but they're not like, and they will use those characteristics to advance themselves forward. Very simple assessments at the end here. In the discussion, I want you to, as difficult as this might be for some people, and I only say that because people have told me this, you're all great at certain things, and it's brag time, so I want you to discuss an area of your life that you consider you're good at, and I want you to tell me why you think you're good at it. What social comparison things did you do, or do you do, or maybe right in the moment you became aware of that you do that told you that you're good at this? How do you know you're good at it? And then that's the discussion. And then in the chapter 13 quiz, I want to talk about that growth mindset. Where are you at with that? How adept are you at surrounding yourself with, which could be, you know, I'm constantly not measuring up, but using that as a jumping place for personal advancement, and just kind of reflecting on that. Do I have a growth mindset? Is that something that I want to pursue? And so those are long lecture here, but those are the work that we have in front of us, and I look forward to seeing you in all those discussion boards.